Okay, we're coming into John chapter 7 this evening. We saw in chapter 6 the sign of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus' discourse in chapter 6 on him being the bread of life. And all that was taking place in Galilee. But in chapter 7, we move on now from Galilee. We'll be going back to Jerusalem. So we want to begin here in chapter 7. We'll read verses 1 to 13 to begin with. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of Tabernacles was at hand, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works you are doing. For no man works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For even his brothers did not believe in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. Go to the feast yourselves. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." So saying, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, "He is a good man," others said, "No, he is leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. In chapters 7 and 8 now, the scene shifts from Galilee to Jerusalem. And from chapter 7, verse 10 through to right through to the end in chapter 21 and verse 1, John makes no further mention of Jesus being in Galilee. At the beginning of chapter 21, Jesus is back in Galilee to make that resurrection appearance at the Sea of Galilee. But between chapter 7 and chapter 21, there is no further reference to Jesus being in Galilee, although we do know from the synoptic gospels that Jesus was ministry continued on in Galilee. It's just that John is not recording these things. And these two chapters, chapter 7 and 8, contain a lengthy discussion between Jesus and the Jews taking place in the temple in Jerusalem. A number of references in the chapters to Jesus teaching in the temple. In chapter 7, verse 14, we're told there about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And then in verse 28 of chapter 7, so Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple. And then in chapter 8, verse 20, for these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple. And then in verse 59 of chapter 8 as well. So they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So chapter 7 and 8 is focused in Judea around the temple. All of this teaching that's going on here from Jesus is taking place there in the temple in Jerusalem. And there are frequent references in these two chapters to the dangers that Jesus was facing at this time, the danger of arrest and also the danger of death. Chapter 7, verse 1 there mentions that Jesus would not go to Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. Verse 13 speaks of the fear of the Jews. For fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Verse 19 of chapter 7, Jesus says to the people there, "Why do you seek to kill me?" And then in verse 25, some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, "Is not this the man whom they seek to kill?" And then in verse 30 as well, so they sought to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. And verse 32, the Pharisees heard the crowd thus muttering about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Verse 44, some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. And then in chapter 8, verse 37, "I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me, because my word finds no place in you." Verse 40 of chapter 8 as well, "But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth." And then in verse 59, so they took up stones to throw at him. So this is the danger that Jesus is facing when he goes to Jerusalem, and when he's there in the temple. There's the danger of arrest, and there's the plot against him to kill him. But although Jesus faced these dangers, he continued to carry out his work and his ministry there. At the beginning of chapter 1, John begins rather vaguely. He says, after this, and that was how chapter 6 began as well. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and chapter 5 as well. After this, there was a feast of the Jews. So John isn't too concerned about following things in a strict chronological order. He just sort of generally places these things following on from one another. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee, he says. Opposition to Jesus was centered in Judea, where the Jews were seeking to kill him. We saw back in chapter 5 and verse 18, in the healing of the man at the pool there in Jerusalem. It was after that that we were told that this was why the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also called God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So these efforts, these attempts to kill Jesus, this plot to kill Jesus, arose really there in Jerusalem from that time. But John tells us here that Jesus went about in Galilee, and he would not go about in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. And Jesus did not want to arouse opposition at this time or do anything which would bring about his premature death. And so at this stage, he's restricting his movements to Galilee. John doesn't tell us here anything of Jesus' activity in Galilee. He just simply says that Jesus went about in Galilee. We learn more from the synoptic gospels about the things that Jesus was doing in Galilee at that time. We have a period here between the Passover in chapter 6, verse 4. The feeding of, just before the feeding of the 5,000 is recorded there. We're told that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And now here in chapter 7 and verse 2, we're told that the Jews' feast of Tabernacles was at hand. So this is a period of about 6 months between the Passover, which happens around end of March, April time, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs some 6 months later around October time. So John passes over that period of 6 months there. We have the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, and then nothing further said other than Jesus going about in Galilee during that 6 months. And now into chapter 7, we're 6 months later here. So we're told that it was the time of the Jews' Feast of Tabernacle. Feast of Tabernacles was at hand, and this was a feast of thanksgiving for the harvest, a harvest festival. And it was also observed as a reminder of the blessings that God had bestowed upon the people of Israel during their 40 years in the wilderness. In remembrance of that time, the people built themselves little shelters or booths made from the branches of trees, and they lived in these sort of temporary dwelling places for the duration of the feast, which lasted for 8 days. So Old Testament references to the Feast of Tabernacles can be found in Exodus chapter 23, verse 16, where it's referred to as the Feast of Ingathering. And then more detail given in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 39 to 43, which says, "On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a solemn rest, and on the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. And you shall take on the first day the fruit of goodly trees, branches of palm trees and boughs of leafy trees and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord 7 days in the year. It is a statute for forever throughout your generations. You shall keep it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All that are native in Israel shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So there's the instructions given there concerning the making of these little booths, or these tabernacles that the people were to live in for the duration of the feast. And we have a record of celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles in the book of Nehemiah, in Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 13 to 18. This is at the time when the people have returned from their exile in Babylon, so they're back in Jerusalem now with the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls around the city, and they are celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles here. So Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 13 begins, on the 2nd day the heads of the fathers' houses of all the people with the priests and the Levites came together to Ezra the scribe in order to study the words of the law. And they found it written in the law that the Lord had commanded by Moses that the people of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, and that they should publish and proclaim in all their towns and in Jerusalem, go out to the hills and bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths, as it is written. So the people went out and brought them and made booths for themselves, each on his roof, and in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the square at the water gate, and in the square at the gate of Ephraim. And all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and dwelt in the booths, for from the days of Jeshua the son of Nun to that day the people of Israel had not done so, and there was very great rejoicing. And day by day, from the first day to the last day, he read from the book of the law of God. They kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the ordinance. So there's an account there of the people celebrating, rejoicing during that Feast of Tabernacles. Now, since it was the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, here in John chapter 7, there would be many people going to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. It was one of the 3 feasts that the people had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate. And Jesus' brothers now challenge him to go up to Jerusalem so that his disciples there may see the works that he is doing. Their argument is that Jesus needs to make himself more widely known. And what better place to do that than in Jerusalem at the time of this great feast? This, they think, would provide the ideal opportunity for Jesus to make a name for himself. So they're sort of advising him on his campaign, how he should run his campaign. And, well, you need to make yourself known. So go to Jerusalem where all the crowds will be and show them what you can do there. So although Jesus' brothers are giving him this advice, we're told here that they themselves did not believe in him. In verse 5 there, John says, for even his brothers did not believe in him. They had really misunderstood his mission when they were making this suggestion. Jesus was not seeking to make a name for himself. He wasn't wanting to boost his popularity rating amongst the people. He had a mission to fulfill, which he knew would involve rejection and suffering. And this was something that his brothers could not understand at this point because of their unbelief. Later on, after the resurrection, they do change. They do become believers after that, but at this stage, they don't. So Jesus' reply to his brothers then is this. He says, my time has not yet come. So it was not yet the right time. This wasn't the suitable opportunity or the proper moment for Jesus to go up to the feast. Jesus had said the same thing to his mother, to Mary, in chapter 2 at the wedding feast in Cana, when she had told him that the wine had run out at the wedding. And Jesus' reply to her was, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Jesus would choose his moment carefully. And here he contrasts himself with his brothers when he says, your time is always here. My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. So all time is the same to them. It makes no difference to them when they go up to Jerusalem. They're placing themselves in no risk whenever they go up to Jerusalem. The brothers had told Jesus to show himself to the world, to make himself known to the world. But Jesus now tells them that the world is hostile towards him. He says to them, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it, that its works are evil. Jesus is speaking against the world, and therefore the world will hate him. So Jesus will never win the approval of the world. And that's really not what he's seeking anyway, because he's testifying against the evil works of the world. But Jesus' brothers are accepted by the world because that's the system that they belong to. They belong to the world. Jesus later on will say something similar to his disciples in chapter 15, in verses 18 and 19. He says to them, or preparing them for the hatred of the world that they would experience, he says, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. There's two different systems at work here. There's the system of the world characterized by its unbelief and its hatred, and then there's the system of Jesus characterized by belief and faith. So Jesus goes on then to tell his brothers to go up to the feast themselves. He says that he's not going up because he says, my time has not yet fully come. Jesus' statement here, I'm not going up to the feast, may seem to pose a bit of a problem, because in verse 10 we see that Jesus did go up to the feast. But there's no great difficulty here. When Jesus said that he was not going up to the feast, he didn't mean that he was not going to go at all. He simply meant that he was not going to go at that moment with his brothers. We learn in verse 10 that he did go up, but he went up privately, not publicly. So he will go at the time of his own choosing and in his own manner. But for the moment, we're told that he will stay in Galilee there in verse 9. So eventually then Jesus does go up to the feast, but only after his brothers had left. They've already gone. And Jesus did not go up publicly as his brothers had suggested, but he went up privately so as not to draw attention to himself. And again, this shows how Jesus is in control over the situation, that he's going to go to Jerusalem when he's ready, and he'll go in his own way. In Jerusalem, we see that the Jews, and remember that John uses the term Jews in reference to the religious leaders rather than the Jewish people in general. We see in verse 11 that they seem to have been expecting Jesus to be at the feast. They're asking, they're looking for him at the feast, and they're saying, where is he? So there's an expectation that Jesus is going to show up at the feast. But amongst the people, opinions were divided about Jesus, as we see in verse 12 here. Some said he is a good man, whilst others thought that he was leading the people astray. And we're told that there was much muttering about him going on, suggesting that the people were talking about Jesus, trying to discuss who he is, what he's all about. The people mentioned there in verse 12 are distinguished from the Jews in verse 13. As we've mentioned, the Jews are the religious leaders. So verse 13 says, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. So the people were a bit cautious. They didn't want to discuss Jesus openly because they were afraid of the Jews. They were afraid of their religious leaders and how they might react to all of that. Again, this shows the opposition and the hostility that is developing against Jesus, that even the people were afraid to talk about him in public. We'll read on here then in chapter 7 from verse 14 down to verse 24. says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. The Jews marveled at it, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he's never studied? So Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If any man's will is to do his will, he shall know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. He who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? And the people answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one deed, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man upon the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Jesus waited then until the middle of the feast, halfway through the Feast of Tabernacles, before he went to the temple to teach the people there. And those who heard him, and again identified as the Jews here in verse 15, were astonished. They're asking, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? The phrase there, has learning, means knows his letters, and it refers to Jesus' knowledge of the scriptures. So they're asking, really, what they're asking is, how is it that this man knows the scriptures when he has never studied under one of the rabbis? In their eyes, Jesus was an uneducated man, and yet here he was teaching the scriptures. So the implication is that Jesus is uttering his own opinions, and really it's not worth listening to. But Jesus' answer to this is that his teaching is not his own. He is not self-taught, and he has not studied or learned under any human teacher. Rather, his teaching, he says, comes from a higher source. It is of divine origin. The teaching comes from the one who sent him into the world. And so to reject his teaching would be to reject the one who sent him. Jesus now suggests that any sincere person who has the desire to do the will of God will recognize the source of Jesus' teaching. They will know whether his teaching is really from God or whether he's just speaking on his own authority. And those who desire to do the will of God will be ones who will be able to understand that and make that distinction. The Jews had questioned Jesus' credentials as a teacher, but now Jesus is questioning their credentials as learners. If they want to do the will of God, then they should be able to discern the source of his teaching and recognize where his teaching is coming from. And the source of a person's teaching can be demonstrated. A person who teaches on his own authority will seek glory for himself, but a person whose teaching comes from God will seek the glory of God. So that person is to be regarded or seen as a true teacher, one in whom there is no falsehood. So the one who wants to bring glory to God should be regarded as a true teacher, someone who's teaching on his own authority just simply is doing it for his own sake, doing it for his own glory. But Jesus then accuses his hearers here of a failure to keep the law of Moses in verse 19 here. Moses was the one who had given them the law, but Jesus says they have not kept it. And receiving the law will be of no value if it is not kept, if it's not obeyed. So they were not keeping the law, and instead Jesus says they're planning to kill him. In verse 19 here, he says, did not Moses give you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? Jesus can see into the hearts of the people, and he knows what their true motives are, motives that they may not even be aware of themselves at this stage. So he's telling them that they don't keep the law and they're planning to kill him. Well, in doing that, they would be breaking the commandment, you shall not kill. So Jesus is pointing out to them how actually they're not keeping the law because they're planning to kill him. However, the ordinary people seem to be unaware of this plot to kill Jesus. And so they put his words down to him being demon possessed here in verse 20. The people answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" This accusation is repeated later as well in chapter 8, verse 48. Where it is the Jews here. The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" And then also in verse 52 of chapter 8, the Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon." And then later on in chapter 10, verse 20, many of them said, "He has a demon and he is mad. Why listen to him?" The same charge was made against John the Baptist as well, as we see in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 18. Where Jesus is speaking of John here. "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon." So the simplest thing to do if you don't agree with someone, if you don't like what they're saying, will just accuse them of being possessed by a demon or being crazy, or being mad. But Jesus answers in verse 21 by referring to one deed which he performed and which they marveled at. Verse 21, he says to them, I did one deed and you all marvel at it. This would be referring back to the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda there in chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5. That was in Jerusalem, and that was the event which then led to that plot to kill Jesus, because he had done that on the Sabbath and he'd claimed God as his own father. Jesus justifies his action there of doing that healing on the Sabbath here in verses 22 and 23 by referring to the law concerning circumcision given by Moses, but as Jesus reminds them, it dates from before that time, from the time of the patriarchs, from the time of Abraham. And the law required that a male baby should be circumcised on the 8th day after its birth. That's in Leviticus chapter 12 and verse 3. And that was the instruction that God gave to Abraham as well in Genesis chapter 17, verse 12, that a male baby should be circumcised on the 8th day. So what happened then if the 8th day fell on the Sabbath? Well, the baby would still be circumcised so that law of circumcision might not be broken. However, performing circumcision on the Sabbath might be regarded as an act which would break the Sabbath prohibition on work. So keeping one law then meant the breaking of another law. So Jesus questions them here. Well, if they are prepared to break the Sabbath law in order to keep the law regarding circumcision, then what right then do they have to be angry with Jesus? Because he healed on the Sabbath for making a man's whole body well. Jesus has done something greater there than the act of circumcision in making a man completely well. So this is a clever argument here on Jesus' part, in which he exposes the inconsistency of the Jews in their attitude towards the Sabbath, that they would perform a circumcision on the Sabbath, if that was the 8th day of the baby's birth, without thinking that they were breaking the law. And yet when Jesus comes along and performs an act of mercy by healing a man on the Sabbath, then they accuse him of breaking the Sabbath, and they plot to kill him. So Jesus then calls upon them to think about the situation and not to judge superficially on outward appearances, but to judge righteously. They're judging Jesus as a lawbreaker. He broke the law by doing that on the Sabbath. But Jesus is referring to this specific case of healing on the Sabbath here, but his words express a general principle for all judgments, really, that no judgment should be formed simply on the basis of outward appearances, as they were doing. We have the expression, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't just judge by outward appearances, but judge righteously, Jesus says. Make those right judgments. Well, reading on here, verses 25 to 36, it goes on to say this: some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? Yet we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, you know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they sought to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him, and they said, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? The Pharisees heard the crowd thus muttering about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Jesus then said, I shall be with you a little longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. The Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying, you will seek me, and you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? This chapter here refers to several groups of people. There are the Jews, who are the religious leaders who are plotting to kill Jesus, and that includes the Pharisees and the chief priests as well. There are the people, or the multitude. These are the crowds of people in Jerusalem. Many have come there as pilgrims to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, and they seem to be unaware of this plot against Jesus. And then in verse 25, we have another group who are the people of Jerusalem. So these are the inhabitants of the city, the people who live in the city, who do know of this plot against Jesus. So in verse 25 there, we see that some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this the man whom they seek to kill? So although these people of Jerusalem knew about the plot to kill Jesus, they're a bit puzzled as to why no action was being taken against him. Why was Jesus being allowed to speak openly and no one was doing anything to prevent it? He'd accused them of failure to keep the law of Moses. He'd accused them of inconsistency, and no one was doing anything about it. So they now begin to consider the possibility that the authorities might actually believe that he was the Christ. Although their question there is in a form which expects a negative answer. Surely the rulers have not become convinced that he is the Christ, have they? They couldn't quite believe that their own authorities, their own rulers would believe that Jesus was the Christ. But whatever the authorities might be thinking, it seems that people of Jerusalem do not believe that he is the Christ. And the reason that he cannot be the Christ is because they know, or they think they know, where Jesus comes from. But they say when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So when the Christ, the Messiah, when he appears, he's just suddenly going to appear. They believed he would suddenly appear in the temple, and that would be it. Nobody would know his origin, where he had come from. But they say they know where Jesus has come from. They thought Jesus was from Galilee, and so they then concluded that, well, he can't be the Christ because we know where he comes from. So Jesus then takes up their comment to assert his true origin in verses 28 and 29. We're told here that he proclaimed, or he spoke out So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, "You know me and you know where I come from." The Revised Standard Version puts that in the form of a question. It might be that he's asking that, or it might be a statement. You know me and you know where I come from, or you think you do anyway. But he goes on to deny that he has come on his own accord. He did not choose to come. He's not a self-appointed prophet, but rather he has been sent into the world by the one who is true, he says. And this one who is true is unknown to the people of Jerusalem. Jesus accuses them here of not knowing God. He says to them there in verse 28, "You know me and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." So he's accusing them of not knowing God. Later in chapter 18, in chapter 8 and verse 19, he makes that assertion as well. They said to him, therefore, "Where is your father?" Jesus answered, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also." And then in verses 54 and 55 of chapter 8, Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say that he is your God, but you have not known him. I know him. If I said I do not know him, I should be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I keep his word." So Jesus' accusation against these people is that they do not know God. This one who is true, then, who Jesus speaks of as the one who is true, is unknown to the people of Jerusalem. However, Jesus knows the one who has sent him because he comes from him and has been sent by him. Jesus states here his divine origin and his mission, that he has come from the Father and he has been sent into the world by the Father. Well, Jesus' words then produce two different reactions amongst the people. There were some who wanted to arrest him and some who believed that he was the Christ. So either Jesus' words were false, in which case he would be guilty of blasphemy, or his words were true, in which case he was the Christ, the Son of God. And although some wanted to arrest him now, we're told that they did not lay their hands on him, because his time had not yet come. It was not the right time yet for Jesus' arrest and his death. These things would happen in accordance with God's timetable of events and not man's. However, there were others who now believed in him, and they could not conceive of the Christ coming and doing more works than Jesus had already done. They're asking there in verse 31, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? What would they be expecting? Jesus has done all these wonderful signs, and that has convinced them, and now they believe in him. So what more would somebody have to do in order to convince them? An attempt is now made to arrest Jesus. The Pharisees had heard of the mutterings of the crowd about Jesus, and now they join with the chief priests in sending officers out to arrest him. But at this stage, all of these attempts to arrest Jesus failed. Again, his time has not yet come. Perhaps in response to this attempt to arrest him, Jesus now spoke of his departure. He says that he will be with them a little longer. So his time is short, and he will eventually return to the one who has sent him, and then those who seek him will be unable to find him because he will have gone to the place where they could not come. Jesus is using language here, which is mysterious language to those who are listening, but he's speaking of his death. He's speaking of the accomplishment of the mission which God had sent him into the world to complete. And at this stage, we're only about 6 months away from that. This is the October time of the Feast of Tabernacles. It will be in the following year, at the Passover of the following year, in 6 months' time, when Jesus will be put to death and when the resurrection will occur. So time is short. So he says, I will be with you for a little longer. Later in chapter 13 and verse 33, he says something similar here. He says to his disciples here, little children, yet a little while I am with you, you will seek me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. So at that stage, they will not be able to join him in what he's about to do. So Jesus' words puzzled the Jews here in verses 35 and 36, and they wondered where Jesus intended to go, that they would not be able to find him. They speculated about him going to the dispersion. The dispersion is a word that's used of the Jews who were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. Many Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire. So not all of the Jews had returned to Judea after the Babylonian exile. Some of them had stayed in Babylon, others of them had moved around, and by this time there are, as we see in the book of Acts, when Paul goes on his journeys, he comes across Jewish communities in many of the places that he visited. So this is what's known as the dispersion or the diaspora. So many Jewish communities existing outside of Judea, and we see that in Acts chapter 2 with all of those people who had come there to Jerusalem from various places. And so they're wondering here whether Jesus is intending to leave Judea and to go to the dispersion, to those communities, and from there move on to teach the Greeks or the Gentiles. Unknowingly, they are sort of predicting what eventually would happen anyway, that message would go out to the Jews of the dispersion and to the Gentiles as well. But at this point, they're clearly puzzled. Jesus' words are mysterious, and they're puzzled by what he means by all of this. So perhaps they feel a little uneasy because of their lack of understanding about what he meant by all of this. So we come to the end here for this evening, and we see this discussion that is going on here between Jesus and the different groups, the various groups, the Jews, the religious authorities, and the people in general there in the temple, and the opinions that people are beginning to form about Jesus. We're not at the end of this yet. We have a bit furthermore of this in the rest of chapter 7 and then into chapter 8 as well, which we will get into next week and the following weeks as well. But we'll stop at this point. But a few things to reflect upon from tonight's passage. Can you identify the different reactions to Jesus from chapter 7 verses 1 to 36? Think about those different groups and the way the different people were reacting to Jesus, what they were saying about him, the opinions that they were forming about him. How can we ensure that we do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment, as Jesus has said there? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. How can we ensure that we do that in our daily lives? And then what did Jesus mean when he said that his time had not yet come? That's a recurring statement that Jesus makes at this time. And then for next week, we'll be looking at the conclusion to chapter 7 and then the first part of chapter 8 down to verse 11 of chapter 8. So that's it for this evening. We'll stop there.